Welcome back, everyone. Thanks for watching the insurance panel. Hopefully you learned something. It was, thanks for the kind words in the chat as well. Very excited about this next spotlight. And we do spotlights again when we feel like we have something really special. And this starts with Kristen Berg, who is a senior compliance officer from OFAC. So how many of you have actually had the opportunity to listen to somebody from the Office of Foreign Assets Control, the part of the Department of Treasury, and hear what they have to say? Kristen is recognized as a financial services subject matter expert with 15 years of domestic and international regulatory experience spanning the US, the EU, Afghanistan. She has dual US Luxembourg citizenship. She's eligible to work in both. She's really a new kind of federal regulator and enforcer. Her specialty is obviously anti-money laundering, and at the Office of Foreign Assets Control, she helps put people in prison for violating AML rules. I know you have civil fines also, but I like your criminal powers the best. Historically, OFAC, I think to me, was a quiet part of the U.S. Treasury Office, flying almost under the radar, but now it's always at center stage as a critical part of the government for combating terrorism and combating ransomware. So just like it took Elliot Ness to put Capone away, we need Kristen Berg to help put a chokehold on ransomware attackers. So thanks, Kristen, for being here, and thanks for your service as well.
I'm happy to be here. Thank you. I'm not sure I can live up to that introduction.
Yes, you can. You absolutely can. Tony Lewis from Sullivan and Cromwell is going to be talking to you. And here he's a lawyer that you can't help but instantly admire. Co-head of the cybersecurity practice group at Sullivan and Cromwell. He spent 11 years at DOJ fighting terrorism, which includes charging the largest ever cyber heist at Bangladesh's central bank that was part of a North Korean conspiracy, which also included computer network intrusions at other banks, and at Sony Pictures Entertainment, which used the WannaCry ransomware. What you might miss from Anthony's bio is just Tony's bio is just how intense the Sony hack investigation really was. While the world was caught up in the salacious details of the Sony emails, which are featured in that Netflix or whatever, that Apple TV show I mentioned with Reese Witherspoon and Jennifer Aniston, Tony was engaged in a high-tech cat and mouse game of epic proportions. His story and the incredible crime that Tony helped solve are told in a 10-episode BBC World Service podcast called The Lazarus Heist. He's also a top-notch litigator and appellate lawyer who, of course, clerked in the Ninth Circuit, yet another rare combination. He has lived the life of a motion picture. He's Fox Mulder meets Perry Mason, and we are thrilled to have him here today. So, Tony, take it away, and we'll really enjoy the spotlight.
Thanks so much, John. Well, Kristen, really a pleasure to have you, to speak with you today. And I know the audience wants to hear from you. Why don't we start by, if you can describe your role at OFAC and sort of orient folks to, the components and where you sit there.
Sure. Yeah, I'm happy to be here today. Hopefully can answer some questions about how, sanctions regulations relate to ransomware attacks and response efforts, and maybe some best practices that can help people avoid these situations. As you say, Tony, I'm a senior compliance officer at the Office of Foreign Assets Control. And in compliance, what I'm really responsible for a lot of the time is outreach and engagement with the private sector to promote compliance with OFAC's sanctions programs, and as well to understand some of the challenges that the private sector may be facing, particularly with some of these rapidly evolving technologies like ransomware. We obviously have sanctions and we have regulatory actions that we take, but despite the emphasis that was put on our, prison powers, what we really want to do is understand the problems that companies are having in complying with what struggles are you having in complying with our regulations so that we can help you out as much as possible. And I just want to add one caveat that, I am speaking in a personal capacity today, informed by my experience with OFAC, as well as my years of experience in the private sector as well. So yeah, that's compliance within OFAC. We also have other divisions that handle enforcement, that handle kind of the parts that are looking at what targets might be appropriate for our sanctions regulations. a lot of different divisions within here.
So then let's talk a little bit about the scenario involving ransomware. I think most folks are familiar with, at least conceptually, running checks against sanctioned entities. OFAC has been very active in the overall crypto ecosystem. And I think it's fair to say that that's no longer simply a matter of checking that the wallet you're sending a potential ransom payment to is on the list of designated entities or names, and that because of the different actions OFAC has taken, it's a more complex ecosystem. And I was hoping you could sort of elaborate on that some and talk a little bit about what those considerations are and what the process, from your point of view, should look like.
Sure. Yeah. So most ransomware attacks, as we well know, are very profit motivated, and ransomware criminals need to launder those illicit proceeds somehow, which happens frequently and almost exclusively in virtual assets. So sanctions regulations like the ones that OFAC administers, as well as AML-CFT requirements, can be a choke point in identifying and disrupting that activity. And some of the ways to do that are, like you say, to check things against lists, but not just wallets. So, OFAC has the SDN list, the specially designated national list. And we do have some wallet information on that list, but it's a very robust list. So you're going to want to look at wallets. You're going to want to look at individuals or entities. Do you know the name of a hacking group, perhaps, behind an attack that you've had? Are they asking you to pay in a certain way that involves a cryptocurrency tumbler or mixer? So you could look at that tumbler or mixer in our SDN list as well. But it's not just limited to the SDN list. So in this potentially never happens to you ransomware situation, you're going to want to take all the information you have in that situation of identifiers, be it names, be it companies, be it wallet addresses, and not only check the SDN list, but also conduct some open source searches or other due diligence wherever you can on the internet, in media. See what you can find out about these players that are affecting you. Our SDN list is definitely a good place to start, though. And we have, since 2021, we've taken numerous sanctions designations against ransomware actors and against services that facilitate the financial transactions for those ransomware actors. So we've designated multiple virtual currency exchanges like SUEX. I think some of you may have heard of these, SUEX and ChatX and Garantex. And as well, some of the darknet markets like Hydra Market, Genesis Marketplace. And this is all at least partially based on their involvement in facilitating those ransomware transactions that we're talking about. We also just last year had 2 bilateral sanctions designations of ransomware actors, along with our UK counterparts. They have a cyber sanctions authority, and those were the first and so far only uses on their part of that cyber sanctions authority. So that was an interesting situation. But yeah, so we've got that. We also issued, in September 2021, we issued an updated ransomware advisory. And this is something that OFAC does. Like I explained, we're not here just to enforce. We are here to help you comply with the regulations that we are enforcing. So advisories like the one we issued on ransomware are focused on disrupting those criminal networks and the virtual currency exchanges responsible for laundering the ransoms, but also have, some primary goals here. One of those is to, on your part, to encourage reporting to and cooperating with law enforcement and other U.S. government agencies in the case that you are subject to a ransomware attack. This is really critical, because the U.S. government's ability to counter these attacks depends on us having a full understanding of the extent and nature of these incidents. So when you report these attacks to law enforcement or to the U.S. government as soon as possible, It can also increase the likelihood of recovering access to your data through other means, such as alternative decryption tools. And the updated advisory really makes some of that clear. And then kind of the second goal is to promote adoption and improvement of cybersecurity practices by U.S. entities to ideally prevent ransomware attacks from occurring in the first place. So with those two things in place, kind of the reporting and communication with the government aspect, and also improvement of practices, companies are setting themselves up for a maximum mitigation opportunity in any related enforcement action.
Yeah. And so to pick that thread up, realize, OFAC is, there's not just one side of the house, there's advisory, and there's also the sort of enforcement side. On the enforcement side, sanctions is a strict liability regime as a legal matter. But if you can talk a little more about sort of how that translates in the context of ransom payments specifically, and what some of the considerations that you have and that companies should be thinking about if they find themselves in a situation where they might need to pay a ransom.
Sure. So as you note, yes, our sanctions regimes are strict liability, which can sound very forbidding. That being said, there's a little bit of give and take there, and discretion on our part in how we approach looking at things. So as we noted in our 2021 advisory that I mentioned, the ransomware advisory, the U.S. government strongly discourages all U.S. companies from paying ransom demands. But we do also understand the damage that this can have on businesses. And we are certainly not looking or seeking to re-victimize victims of ransomware attacks with any kind of enforcement action that's just going to compound the damage. So, just to reemphasize the importance of two actions that we consider to be significant mitigating factors when we're looking at enforcement actions. In the event a sanctions nexus is found in connection with any ransomware payment is, number one, reporting attacks to and cooperating with law enforcement. And then number two, adopting or improving cybersecurity practices. And both of those things would be viewed favorably by OFAC in the event that there is a sanctions nexus to any potential ransomware payment that was made.
I think it's a point worth underscoring, because I think this comes up, when companies think about, well, what's in it for us to report something to law enforcement, and there's a sort of being a good corporate citizen is one of those considerations, and potentially getting some sharing of information as the victim of a cyber attack is another. And I hear you to say that that is explicitly one of the considerations that OFAC takes into account when it thinks about a sanctions enforcement action. Is that fair?
Yeah, it's definitely a thing we take into account. We want to hear from companies when they've had a ransomware attack. We want to hear from people when they've been the victim of this kind of thing, because as you say, good corporate citizenship, but it also helps us. Part of our job is to track that down and to help prevent it. And the way for us to track that down and prevent it as the government is to have more information about where it's happening and how it's happening and what are the specifics of how it has presented to any particular company or victim, because all of those clues are things that help us then strengthen our regimes to counter and prevent ransomware attacks.
Great. So earlier you mentioned, when doing sort of sanctions compliance checks, you might have the name of a hacking group. Maybe a company's gotten that from the forensic investigative firm they're working with. Maybe they've done some of their own analysis. Attribution is something that comes up in responding to, all kinds of cyber incidents, but in a ransomware attack, it's certainly one of the questions that's central, because figuring out who is responsible for an attack can help inform who it is you might be paying, and what sanctions issues might be in play. Particularly given that decision has to be made sort of in short order as far as whether to pay a ransom or not. We walk the sort of issues that companies might face on attribution, and what they can do, given that that's a sort of tight timeline, but a significant question for sanctions considerations.
Yeah. So this sounds like, we're talking about a situation where a company's been put in a ransomware attack situation, and then they've been made aware of a sanctions nexus related to the ransom payment. So in that case, we would, again, strongly encourage any victim of a ransomware attack to contact OFAC if there is a reason to suspect a potential sanctions nexus. And this could include, but certainly not limited to, potential positive search results on our SDN list, connection to a sanctioned jurisdiction. Some jurisdictions have broader sanctions, such as Iran, publicly or privately available information that indicate a nexus, or even a suspicion that a ransomware variant or payment may benefit a blocked person or other person subject to U.S. sanctions prohibitions. So, when you report that to us and talk about that sanctions nexus, we would recommend that the victim and or your agent, if you have other people involved with responding to this, document the reasoning for making that ransom payment, and then also any of the evidence you have for the potential sanctions nexus. We would consider the reporting to the attack to law enforcement and or OFAC, again, a significant mitigating factor in determining an appropriate response to an apparent violation. So, to back up a step again to what I said, document your reasoning, document the evidence you have. Candor cannot be, emphasized enough. That candor with OFAC is going to be really helpful. Not only does that give us good information for countering future ransomware attacks, but it helps us understand your response to the ransomware attack and where you were coming from. What kind of dilemmas was it? Are you a hospital and you've got patient sensitive data that is just time critical that you need back? These are all factors that we definitely need to know.
Sure. Okay, so then, we've talked about OFAC's guidance and its sort of enforcement considerations. There are obviously other federal and state agencies that have become active in not only cybersecurity, of course, but in ransomware and paying ransom payments specifically. There's pending rulemaking by CISA under the SERSA statute. DFS now requires companies to report a ransom payment pretty quickly. And so I wonder if you can talk some about how you think that's changing, the landscape and the sort of considerations for making a ransom payment, with those additional regulatory obligations that companies would face if they need to do so.
Sure. I mean, it's definitely changing the landscape in regards of providing more routes and more ways to notify not just the U.S. government, but as you say, you refer to New York DFS, to notify regulatory agencies about ransomware attacks, to put that information out into the regulatory and law enforcement sphere so that can be used in responding to ransomware attacks. But what this does is that it provides more opportunities for some of that mitigation that I was talking about. When you're using candor, and being as forthcoming as possible with OFAC or with law enforcement or with DFS. That helps to shape the enforcement response in the event there's a sanctions nexus found in connection with the ransom payment. I can say that in the case of OFAC, there are kind of two main types of enforcement actions, public and non-public. Public actions would include civil penalties in response to violations, but non-public actions could just be a cautionary letter or a no action letter. And, I can't speak to non-public enforcement actions, but I can say that to date, there have been no public enforcement actions targeting a victim of a ransomware attack. So this distinction between public and non-public is really important, because if a company or an agent involved in responding to a ransomware attack takes some of those mitigating steps we've talked about, OFAC is more likely to respond to any potential violation with a non-public enforcement response.
Sure, I think that's a really helpful fact to underscore. We had one question. We have a couple questions. One, we're talking now about other regulatory obligations. We've talked about notifying law enforcement. One of the questions was, should companies be separately notifying OFAC of making a ransom payment generally, or is the sort of notification to law enforcement, like the FBI or Secret Service or the like, sort of sufficient, except until there may be a sanctions issue that's in play that's discovered?
I think in the interests of full information across the law enforcement and regulatory spectrum, it would definitely be a good idea to also notify OFAC separately, just so that you've covered your bases. We actually have a hotline. You can find information on our website about that. There's a phone number and an email address. And this is an easy way to reach out to us. If you don't have any other way to reach out to OFAC, I know that people who have maybe hired a law firm to help them, their law firm, like, Tony, your law firm has plenty of contacts within OFAC. But lacking that, we do have this feedback hotline, and just get in touch with us and say, listen, here's the situation, here's what happened, this is my ransomware attack, and give us as many facts as you have. And you can even say in there, I don't know of a sanctions nexus right now, but that at least provides some information and potentially gives us an opportunity to give you a little bit of guidance should it be necessary around the ransomware. But the advisory I've mentioned is actually on our website as well, so you can look for that ransomware advisory on the website. But ultimately, answer to the question, yes, absolutely, reach out to OFAC.
Okay. And then, I think we're getting close to the end here. Do you have some final takeaways for folks to keep in mind in this, the sort of the sets of considerations we've talked about for thinking about making a ransom payment?
Sure. I think the main takeaway is that the intent of that advisory I've mentioned was to give some additional clarity with respect to what victims can expect if they make a ransom payment. And, to emphasize that we understand, to your point about attribution, we understand that attribution in the ransomware space can be difficult. And we're not looking to play gotcha in the event that a sanctions nexus is later discovered. What we're looking to do is provide guidance and help for how you respond to that once you have that information. So as long as you've taken some of those steps we've talked about, reporting, cooperating with law enforcement and OFAC, and really strengthening your defensive and resilience measures to protect and prevent that in the first place, that does set you up for maximum mitigation from OFAC in the event there is a nexus that is later found with a ransom payment.
Sure. Well, that's extremely helpful. Thank you so much, Kristen, for speaking with me and with us. And I'll pass it back to Bruce to carry on.
Thank you, Tony, and thank you for a great job moderating. Kristen, thank you to you and to OFAC for joining us today and sharing some of this information, which is just really, really important, really valuable. So thank you both. The next panel is in 5 minutes. It's on CISO and other personal liability pitfalls, which should be quite interesting. We'll be back in just a few minutes. Thank you.